she'll shake your windows and rattle your walls. But the times they are changing. Yes, they're changing.
In today's episode of Mindshift Podcast, we're going to hear the second half of my conversation with Steve Stone Sr., the Starbucks pastor, as he talks about escaping fundamentalism and embracing inclusion. This is the conclusion of the conversation that we started last week. In this episode today, we're going to get into Steve's views on LGBTQ people, how that has evolved, how that has changed, how he is welcoming them into the Christian faith, into the Christian church. And of course, this is a huge hot button issue. It always has been, really, from the point of view of the evangelical, the conservative, the fundamentalist, viewpoint. They are absolutely concerned about this. Abortion and homosexuality in America are the two kind of cardinal sins. From their point of view, the hermeneutic, or the way they read the scripture, the way they interpret the Bible, they would see it as homosexuality is a perversion. It's against God. It's against the laws of God. It's against the scriptures. And therefore, from their point of view, it's absolutely clear, black and white, that you can't be gay and a Christian. You cannot be gay and become part of the church. Now, of course, if you're gay, you might be able to join a very liberal denomination, but the conservatives, the fundamentalists, they would look at those and say that they've gotten it wrong, that their reading of the Bible is incorrect, that they should not be inclusive. They should be taking a much harder line, a much tougher stance against issues like homosexuality. And we heard Steve mention last week that he's been called a progressive, a liberal, and I said probably a heretic too. Why in the world would they call him a heretic? Well, I wanted to read you a post that Steve put up on Facebook a few weeks ago, and it's all about this issue of welcoming and being inclusive. And if you remember, we talked about this last week. I mentioned that we were going to get into this topic of how Steve loves to stir things up on Facebook. Steve kind of plays the role of provocateur. He loves to post these statements on Facebook and just see what the reaction, what the responses are. And this post, which is written by an anonymous author that he quotes, actually kind of shows or demonstrates Steve's kind of worldview, sort of where he's coming from on this issue as well as some others. And it says, quote, "For all of you who aren't sure, it is possible to be gay and Christian. It's also possible to believe in God and science. It is possible to be pro-choice and anti-abortion. It is equally possible to be a feminist and love and respect men. It's possible to have privilege and be discriminated against, to be poor and have a rich life, to not have a job and still have money. It is possible to believe in sensible gun control legislation and still believe in one's right to defend oneself, family, and property. It's possible to be anti-war and pro-military. It's possible to love thy neighbor and despise his actions. It is possible to advocate Black Lives Matter and still be pro-police. It is possible to not have an education and be brilliant. It is possible to be Muslim and also suffer at the hands of terrorists. It is possible to be a non-American fighting for the American dream." And the statement concludes by saying, "It is possible to be different and the same. We are all walking contradictions of what, quote, normal looks like. Let humanity and love win," end quote, by an unknown author. And this is kind of reflective of Steve's own worldview. Embracing diversity, embracing inclusion. And this is what we're going to be getting into in this episode today. I'm glad to be bringing you part 2 here with Steve. It's been a pleasure to get to know him a little bit over the last year or so. As I mentioned, I heard him on the Holy Heretics podcast a while ago. I think it was about a year ago. And we become friends on Facebook. And I've kind of followed him there and watched the responses. And I've responded a few times. It's been good to kind of put a face to the name. And that's what he said when we finally got together to chat and do this recording several weeks ago. And I'm really glad, too, that there are people like Steve Stone Sr. out there. You may or may not agree with his position on the Bible, on Jesus, or whether or not LGBTQ people should be included in the church, but at least you'll hear his point of view. And again, that's what this podcast is all about, learning to think critically. And the best way to do that is by listening to multiple points of view. Whether or not you agree or disagree with them, at least you'll have heard them. And hopefully I'm modeling for you a way to do that, a way going forward. And I think that's very important right now, especially with all the backlash that's coming against the evangelical church, at least in America for sure, with all the political stuff that's going on. And this is what Steve and I are going to get into as well in this episode. And I think it really relates to this issue of how the evangelical church is being portrayed and perceived, not just in America, but indeed the rest of the world. What's the future of the Christian church? where's this thing heading? And this is a real concern, I think, for people that are still staunchly defending evangelicalism and the core doctrines of the faith. And most of these people would take a stance that would say something like, being gay is a sin, being gay is against the Bible. And while they might claim things like, well, you have to love the sinner but hate the sin, the fact is, I think a lot of them actually hate the sinner as well. So what we want to do in this episode is find out the story of how Steve's views have evolved on this issue of accepting and welcoming LGBTQ people into the church. And maybe if this describes you at all, I don't know where you're at on this issue. Maybe you haven't thought it through, but hopefully listening to Steve talk about his own evolution of thought might help you to go down that journey as well and maybe open your mind up just a little bit more. Now, before we get into the second half today, I want to remind you, where did we leave off last week? Well, Steve was describing what he kind of calls this ethic of love. There's no more powerful force in the universe than love, he said, and he believes that really Jesus stood for but one thing, and that was love, loving other people. And this view on inclusion really embraces this ethic of love that he himself tries to live by. So we're going to pick up that thread this week in part 2. So let's go on into the discussion with Steve. Let's talk about escaping fundamentalism and learning to embrace inclusion and how this ethic of love somehow relates to this whole discussion. So as the song has it, love is my religion. In a way, that's kind of your core value. That's kind of, if you boiled everything down and said, okay, what does Steve Stone stand for? Hopefully it's going to be love. And that's what you're saying that's the message of Jesus as you understand it.
Right. You know, love the Lord your God is not hard if you understand God as Jesus taught and lived and died and my faith rose again. And love your neighbor is just gratitude for the way God is. God is love. God made us in God's image, and loving our neighbor is how we live that out. And it's not rocket science. It's not always easy to do, but it's a very simple faith. And to me, it's the one Jesus taught. He said everything goes under love God and love your neighbor. If it doesn't fit under those two, it just doesn't fit.
Doesn't fit in. I'm curious too, because it's interesting. Here you are labeled a progressive and a liberal and, I don't know, heretic maybe. I don't know. But what's funny about it is
some do.
Some do. Yeah. You've been called a heretic. What's funny about the whole thing, though, is that, especially in America today, the evangelical church is suffering under, I think, looking at it from across the pond here in Great Britain, they're losing on the credibility front because of all the politics and everything else. But you guys are actually, whatever you want to label your church or your belief system, you're actually out there doing stuff for the community, and not because of to increase credibility, but because you really believe that's what we're supposed to be doing. If you really want to be a Christian, then take care of your neighbor. Right. That's whether he's Muslim, whatever, African American, whatever the skin color. So you're actually on the forefront of doing stuff, whereas the fundamentalists and the evangelicals are out there, picketing and doing all kinds of other stuff and being, trying to pass legislation and all the rest of it to get their agenda passed, I guess. I don't know.
Right. Right. It's just all love. I mean, to me, if it's not love, it's not the way of Jesus. We used to say at Heart Song, we accepted everybody, of course. And our little saying was, we catch him, we let him clean them. That's not our job.
Not your job.
Our job is not to get in between a relationship with somebody and Jesus. It's to help introduce them to each other. That they can take it from there.
Well, in terms of demographics, what sort of person comes to Heart Song? Is there sort of a profile of person who comes to the church and ends up finding a home there?
Yes, that it tends to be, here's the way I would describe us to the flock, which would get them the most stirred up. We're a grateful, recovering, Jesus-following tribe of knotheads, hotheads, and assorted nuts.
Yeah, I think
if you don't fit in any of those categories, you're in denial, and we'll take you too. So it was just an eclectic group of people that it's hard in the South to find people who don't have some church experience, Southern America. But there's a lot of people in the South who were church hurt, or church disappointed, or church rejected, or never went to the church because of they feared all that kind of stuff. Those are the kind of people that tended to migrate toward heart song. It would be people who once thought they were no people, but then found out they were God's people.
I think that's a good point to make too, isn't it? Because the people that I'm interacting with on Evangelical and other places on Facebook, they're angry theists, or they're really, really angry. Like you say, they've been burned or hurt by the church, but the story isn't over. The journey isn't over by any stretch. They might find a place like Heart Song and find a home. Who knows? I don't know, but there's the continuing journey for people. I mean, I haven't found a church that I could plug into. I left church over 10 years ago, and I just haven't found anywhere that I'd even want to try and invest my time, money, effort, and energy. So over here in Britain, it's a quite a different story because of the Church of England, and it's a very old traditional kind of churches, and so it's very different than the American context for sure. Now, speaking of the differences between Britain and America, going back to this Facebook thing, you post these really inflammatory statements all the time, and I like I say, sometimes I respond to them, but what I'm fascinated by is I read the responses of other people, and you run the gamut. I said, you must be a glutton for punishment because you tend to put things up there very critical of Donald Trump or evangelicalism, or you were saying the other day about being more inclusive of LGBT people. And I saw a range of responses. Some people were like, hey, finally someone's saying it, a prominent voice in Christianity, and others were ripping you to shreds. So why do you feel like that's your kind of platform now? Why do you post these kind of statements all the time?
Well, I'd never do it in my own heart anyway, or in my own mind, unless there at the root of it is some idea of love. I mean, I'll criticize 45 Trump, but I also pray for him. That he'll have an open heart and mind and really understand what the good news is. And honestly, I don't have a lot of hope in those prayers, but I make those prayers. Anything I post to me is I know a lot of it's provocative, but to me it's to provoke some dialogue. And if someone is living a lie, or that's something that they don't enjoy, really, that it doesn't work for them. I doubt if fundamentalism really works for anybody. They're just afraid to give it up. So I have no trouble taking names and kicking ass about that kind of stuff, because I think it's akin to what Jesus did with the scribes and Pharisees.
You're calling people out.
And people, who he thought were blowing their lives by letting fear and ignorance rule them.
Are you more critical of Donald Trump, the president, or the evangelical support for Donald Trump? What's more important in your view?
Well, to me, it's wherever anti-love is being expressed. If something is not loving, if it's working against the mission of Jesus, to me, to bring love to the world and the world to love, then it doesn't matter to me where it is. It could be in another pastor, it could be in a political candidate, it could be anywhere. It just so happens that Trump makes himself an easy target, and these evangelicals make themselves an easy target by saying and doing stupid and evil things.
What do you think's the motivation for the evangelical support for Trump? Because, there's been a lot of articles written and tweets all over the place and Facebook posts about why people think they're doing it. I've written some stuff on it. They're concerned to advance their agenda, and so that's why they're kind of turning a blind eye to some of the moral failings, shall we say, of the president. What do you think is motivating them to do what it is they're doing? How can they possibly justify, like you said, with the simple message of Jesus, at least, with what's going on?
Right. I think they're trying to protect someone who they think agrees with their religious agenda. I'm not sure he agrees with anything except what is going to suit him or promote him, but they tend to think that he's going to pander to some of their religious views or political views, and some of their views are political. They don't even realize that they think they are religious. So they're willing to put up with all the other stuff and defend it so that they don't lose this champion of a few issues that they think are important. And I think that's just a sellout. There are other people that could be decent human beings and act decently and not evilly, that could stand for some of these issues that they think are so important. And I would have no problem with that.
And of course, the hypocrisy has been pointed out in many different places. This group of people were the same ones who, when Bill Clinton was having affairs with Monica Lewinsky, were screaming all over the place about the importance of family values and how integrity in leaders matters and character matters. I remember this because I went through the whole thing when all that was going on back in the day.
Right.
You think, now wait a minute, you're not even applying the same standard when it's your guy in the White House. Everything's fine. So yeah, there's a lot of hypocrisy going on.
Oh, there is, and I agree with what they said about Clinton.
I did too.
Same thing's true about Trump. And chatting with somebody the other day, and they said, well, it's just nobody's business that he had an affair with a porn star. I said, you don't really believe that. That speaks to character. That speaks to judgment. That speaks to impulse control. That speaks to covenant and keeping your word and not, it's just that one little thing, although it's not little, that one thing speaks to so many core character issues that you need in a leader that are just absent. It just boggles my mind.
Well, it's modern day presidential. That's what it is.
Yeah.
What it shows me is, I guess, and people will say, well, this is postmodernism. This is the symptom of what we've been talking about for the last 15, 20 years, certainly in theology. I can remember reading books on postmodernism and, back then when I was in seminary, we had all these real serious talks about how society is shifting, and these are markers of why things are different now. That nobody cares about the fact that that a public figure has an affair, when that would have it did destroy people's whole political careers not that many years ago. Nobody cares. Now it's about the hush money, and it's about all these other things, and perhaps violating campaign laws and stuff like that. That's where they're going to get him, if they're going to get him anywhere. So yeah, who knows? If it's postmodernism at work, I don't know. But now you mentioned one last thing I wanted to get into was this whole thing about your views on being more inclusive of LGBT people. How have your views evolved over the last, I don't know how far back you want to go, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years? Have they evolved? And if so, how has that happened? And what would be your message for people that are listening in today that might be struggling with, okay, I don't know what to do? Give us your advice, Steve. what would you say on that?
Well, as far as the evolution of my thought and faith about it, I was raised, as I said, Southern Baptist, and homosexuality was an anathema, not to be talked about, and it just was, and that's the way it was. And then I've had, again, life experiences with people. I can remember when I was in Georgia, there was a fellow who came to our church, older man, probably in his 60s, started coming to the church, and I say it's obvious. To me, it seemed obvious that he was gay. And he was effeminate in his behavior and speech, and it was almost like an advertisement. I'm telling you, I'm gay. And he invited me to his home, and so I went and was visiting with him. And at some point, he propositioned me, and I said, "Wow, Roy, I love you, but that's not. I'm just not that. I said, I want to be your friend, but that's about it." And we talked some more, and he told me some about his lifestyle. And I said, "Roy, I would be okay with you if you were in a monogamous relationship with somebody, but this serial, sexuality, it just doesn't seem like it humanizes you or the other person." So I think that experience with him started me thinking a little bit about that. And then I saw that lifelong partners, whether at the time I agreed that they should be or not, were excluded from hospitals and wills and things like that. And I thought, well, that's just not right. A few years later, I had a pastor friend who tried as hard as he could to be straight. He dated women. I mean, again, it was obvious to those who knew and loved him that he was gay, but he tried real hard not to be. And so those kind of experiences just began to make me open up, think about it, pray about it. And I've always been more willing to follow the Holy Spirit, to follow Jesus and the teachings of Jesus, than I was to whatever the culture would say. And so I think it was just a case of, over the years, the teaching of Jesus continuing to work on me, continuing to open my heart and mind, to the point where I just don't think I don't think to God it's a big deal. I can't understand why folks think people are wrong for who they are. And if they are who they are, it doesn't matter to me whether it's environmental or genetic or a combination of the two. It's just the way God made them. And so why can't they express that? Why can't they have marriage? Why can't they? So that's what it was for me. It was a journey toward understanding that the love of God is always bigger than my understanding of it. It's always bigger than what I think it will include and embrace.
What kind of responses have you gotten on your Facebook posts? Are you getting the classic sort of evangelical fundamentalist quoting Bible verses to prove, quote unquote, that homosexuality is an abomination? And do you get that response from some people?
Oh yeah, I get that a lot, because a lot of people's theological views are based on how they interpret the Scripture. And, based on how they interpret the Scripture, there's, to them at least, a core of Scripture that speaks against homosexuality. I don't think there is, especially in the teaching of Jesus. And so, yeah, they'll throw a lot of Scripture at me, and I'll throw some back about that love is the key. Love is everything. It's about loving God and your neighbor. It's about expressing love. When you've loved your neighbor, you've fulfilled the law. All that kind of stuff, law, and all that is under the banner of love. In Christ, there's no male nor female, nor Jew nor Greek, no slave nor free. So there's no or anything. There's nor gay nor straight. there's nothing under Christ. We're all one. Yeah, those kind of biblical arguments come, but I have to tell people at some point, I don't worship the Bible. I worship Jesus, and his ethic of love just extends to all creation.
I think, at some level, you're going to have to do something with the text, aren't you? Like you say, it's not into bibliolatry, worshiping the Bible as somehow, this is the end all be all. It's a book of rules, and that's how we have to interpret it. It's got all the answers for all of life's problems. I think, again, this is where people can tend to paint themselves into a corner. I've seen similar posts on things where I've commented and things, and then people have come back at me with a bunch of proof texts. In fact, I wrote an article about the unwavering logic of proof texting. What's behind it? What's the mentality there? For someone who thinks that the Bible is their basic frame of reference through which they interpret the world and everything around them, then it makes sense to list, if I've got more proof text than you, I guess I'm going to win the argument, I suppose. I don't know, when do they consider themselves winning? Was when you admit you're wrong,
well,
I guess?
They consider themselves winning because they feel like their understanding of the Bible is the correct one. And it's hard for them to see that their understanding of the Bible is built on a plausibility structure that they have inherited or bought into, and that it is an interpretation of the Bible, not necessarily the interpretation of it. But they feel like they're correct. And when you show discrepancies in their thinking because of the way they look at the Bible, then boy, do they get angry, which means they're afraid, which means, it's kind of striking at the core of their logic that it doesn't really hold water the way they tend to look at it.
I think so much of it is, it's deeply rooted in their very identity. It's so part and parcel of their identity, the way they see themselves, that, if you question that, then everything falls apart. So yes, it must be defended at all costs. And so, for them to argue that a gay person is going to hell and that's what the Bible teaches and all the rest of it, that's just part of their whole worldview, I guess you could say. What do you hope to accomplish with your Facebook platform? Are you really thinking you're going to change people's point of view? Or just, some people just love to argue. You've got more energy than I do, because I used to get into arguments with people about Donald Trump and evangelicalism and stuff, but it just became exhausting. Right. So, what's the end game? What do you hope to accomplish?
Well, a brief story to kind of illustrate it. Is Rush Limbaugh a known character in the UK?
Well, we know who he is. I know who he is. I actually used to listen to him when I was a staunch conservative myself, but he's not a big name over here. Right. No. But yeah, I know who he is.
But anyway, a staunch conservative radio broadcast show, you kind of get the idea of what that's like. There's a guy here in Memphis called Ben Ferguson, and he's on CNN now doing some commentary, but he's like the local Rush Limbaugh, just very conservative line. And he had me on his program about the friendship with the Muslim congregation across the street. And of course, he castigated me, and his callers castigated me, and it was just about 2 hours of just lambast toward me. Although I will say during the break, he came out and said, "This is great. Can you stay another hour?"
Great for the ratings.
It was a great radio. So when I got home, my wife was angry at me because she had listened to it, and she said, "Why do you do that? Why do you talk with people? Why do you engage people that you know are just going to try to cut you to ribbons?" She said, "Why did you do it?" And I said, "Well, here's why I do it. Because I know that a lot of his listeners, and that I'm not going to convert. They're not going to change a whit because of what I say. Maybe, but that's not my motivation. My motivation is people out there listening that are like Mark Sharp, the guy in the Starbucks video that had the change of heart when he realized that he was the problem, not the Muslim people that he hated. I said, there are people out there listening who have not decided, who are open-hearted and open-minded, and that's who I'm talking to. That's who I'm trying to reach. People who haven't made their mind up about these things and are willing maybe to be more loving if they have an option. If they just listen to him, if they just listen to his listeners, they've got nothing as an alternative. It's like me growing up in a fundamentalist church. I didn't know there was an alternative. So I'm trying to present an alternative understanding of who Jesus is and the love ethic, and in hopes that not the hardcores are going to get converted, though that would thrill me, but that people that are trying to make up their mind, that don't really know where they are, would have something else to latch on to.
Yeah, even if there's one person who listens, I guess it's worth it in that sense, isn't it? There's a lot of personal pain and heartache that you go through, though. I just get too upset. I mean, I'll debate with someone, I guess, but I've become more and more less tolerant, I guess, of people who just, when I can see that all they're doing is doubling down and arguing and they just want to fight with me. I've actually unfriended people from Facebook because I thought, why am I doing this? I'm getting frustrated. I'm getting upset, and it's not changing them, and I'm not changing. So this is just pointless. So I'm glad that you're out there.
Right.
You're in the trenches, Steve. You're fighting the good fight, man. I mean,
well, and I enjoy it. I enjoy the give and take, and because sometimes things happen that you don't expect. When the Muslim thing was at its height, I got a call from a guy who just hated me for it, and he just tore me apart. But every time he would say something hateful to me, I'd come back with love. Hateful love, hateful love. And finally, after about 30 minutes, he just got real quiet. And he said, "You know what? I just want to thank you." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because I'm in pain all day long. I'm in such pain that I have to be packed in ice. And the people that deal with me every day treat me like I'm a thing. I'm just a project." He said, "You've treated me like a human being." And he said, "I still think you're crazy, but man, thank you." I mean, that's worth it. That's worth it all to me.
That's huge, isn't it? It really is a massive thing.
It
because
is.
Here's this guy, and you're just saying, but on a pure human level, I'm gonna be the bigger person in a way. I'm not gonna engage with the rhetoric, but on a human level, this guy just needs to be loved, as I guess we all do. We all need love, man. And
right.
That's the Jesus
right.
message.
And for me, it may be tough love. I'm not going to say it. I'm not one who believes that being nice and being a Christian are the same thing. Jesus wasn't very nice sometimes.
I was going to say, just read your Facebook posts and So this is the question: how can people get a hold of you? Should people look you up on Facebook? What's the best way if they want to connect with you?
Yeah, they can look me up on Facebook. It's just Steve Stone and Cordova, Tennessee. Maybe it says Bartlett now. But hey, here's my phone number. It's 901-337-1346. And, I'm happy to talk with anybody anytime about anything. If they don't have my cell phone number, they're the last ones in the universe to have it. So I'm an open book.
I was going to say, you're the first person I've ever had. I've been doing this podcast almost 2 years now. You're the first person who's ever given up their own phone number for anyone to call you. So you might just get a call from somebody in Great Britain or somewhere wondering who the hell is this Steve Stone guy who's giving out
That's cool.
his phone
I'm
number.
fine with that, and if somebody calls and they've just lost their mind and just rip me up and won't listen, I just block them.
I was going to say, you thank me for it because it's going to be someone that I turned on to you. Well, listen, Steve Stone, thank you so much for being a guest on the show. It's been a wonderful conversation. I'm really glad that we connected on Facebook. I want to say a big thank you to the Holy Heretics for turning us on to your story and then just kind of following your journey and certainly still being written, isn't it?
Absolutely. Are those guys still going? Because when I go try to hear the podcast now, it says you're caught up, and that was like from February or something. Are they still going?
Well, one of them left. Scott left the show, and John carried on for a while, but I don't know if they're doing if he's doing new episodes on his own. So it may be that they're on hiatus right now, which is a shame because they had a really good thing going there for a while. But
absolutely. Absolutely. And I would say, stay tuned because last time I talked to John, he was talking about, taking Holy Heretics, to video.
Yeah, he's definitely, he's into music and everything else. In fact, we've been kicking back and forth the idea of him coming over here to Great Britain and doing some music over here. So you never know. Cool. We might end up having, John Scott on this podcast live from North Wales. You just never know.
Oh, that would be real cool. Hey, and if you're ever back in Memphis, I can take you to the real barbecue places.
Now that sounds like something I would definitely take you up on. I would love to get some barbecue, some good blues music. You can hook me up. So thanks so much, Steve Stone, for being on the show.
Absolutely. Love to you and love to your dear wife.
Perhaps the easiest way, I think, to vilify or to marginalize some other group that we don't like or simply don't agree with is to characterize or refer to them as the other, as them. And one of the friends I've had on this podcast before, Andrew Gurovich, that's one of his favorite sayings. He posts a lot of things on Facebook too, like Steve Stone, that are quite provocative. And one of his favorite sayings is, there is no them, there is no other. And I think the beautiful thing about this conversation and last week's with Steve Stone, whether you're looking at the issue with the Muslims that were looking to build a mosque next door to his church and the story that came out of that as he built relationships with their leaders and then his church with their mosque, and the amazing story, not just how the two communities came together, but then what they were able to do for their community and in fact are still doing for their community around the Memphis, Tennessee area, or his views on LGBTQ people, how that's changed, how that's evolved, how he's become more inclusive. It all goes back to this ethic of love. So much of it goes back to that statement that I read that was on Steve Stone's Facebook wall that he posted a few weeks ago. The idea that you don't have to look at the world as a black and white, as a binary opposition, good and bad, sacred and secular, Muslim, Christian, gay, straight, black or white, people of color, whatever labels we want to slap on people. That's going to make them the other. It's going to make them different than us, someone to be afraid of, someone not to have a relationship with. But one of the things I love about Steve Stone is that here's a guy, whether or not you agree with where he's coming from, I don't care. He's at least doing it. He's at least modeling what he believes to be that ethic of love. And I go back to that statement that he made in part 1. Love is the most powerful force in the universe. If we can understand it, that doesn't mean we all live up to the standard of love, whether or not you think Jesus modeled it or stood for it or taught it or whatever. It really doesn't matter. Can we learn to embrace the other? There is no them. as the saying goes. So I hope you've enjoyed this week and last week with Steve Stone Sr. I was going to say one thing about it is that Steve's the only guy, the first guy I've ever had on this podcast in almost a year and a half now of doing this show, who's actually given you his own cell phone, his own mobile phone number. So if you really want to talk to Steve, call him up. He's expecting your phone call. Just let him know that I sent you. So what is coming up here on Mindshift Podcast in the next few weeks and into the next few months even too? Well, as I mentioned, I've got part 1 and part 2 coming your way with a friend of mine, Brian Staples. He and I went to Bible college many, many years ago down in Portland, Oregon, and we recently met up down in the Seattle-Tacoma area and did a recording. Also, I've been traveling back and forth to the States quite a bit. I've been going to Seattle from the United Kingdom, but one of the really cool things about going back and forth is that I've been able to be with my family. My wife's basically quit her job. She's moved over there for now to take care of her father who's got a brain tumor, and so she's his primary caregiver. So I've been going back over there doing some work and seeing the family, but I've also been able to line up a few really cool podcast recordings. I'm going to be meeting with some friends of mine probably in the month of July sometime. When this episode drops, I'll actually be back over there. I'm going to meet with some friends that I actually went to Christian high school with, and we're going to be talking about kind of what it was like to grow up evangelical, sharing some absolutely crazy stories and what that's done to us in terms of our mental health. Also, we're going to be talking to Daniel Hobbs as well. We're going to have him coming up in a few weeks too. He's going to be talking about his campaigns on Twitter, sort of like taking a stand against evangelicalism and what that's all about, what motivates him to sort of take this stand. He's come out of Bible college and all this, and there's just an absolutely amazing story there. So I'm going to be talking to Daniel as well. So those are all coming up in the next few weeks and months here on Mindshift Podcast. I'm also trying to get Gary Hayes back on the show, who was on the podcast last year. We're going to get together here on The Rock and do some recordings, hopefully this summer at some point. Also, my sister Valerie is going to be coming over here to the United Kingdom in August. We did a show last year called Surviving a Fundamentalist Upbringing, and we're going to be doing another podcast. We're going to be doing an update 1 year later, almost exactly a year later, as to what's changed in her life and what's changed in my life. And I think that's going to be an absolutely fascinating story. And I'm really excited to get into the conversation with my sister Valerie Cunningham and find out what's happened to her in the last year. So I am really excited. There's some absolutely amazing, great content headed your way. So stay tuned next Friday. Catch part 1 with Brian Staples right here on Mindshift Podcast.